Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. And thanks, Andrea. It's 1 o'clock in the morning in Berlin, and she looks as chipper as ever. And I've met Andrea through a group that we all belong to, and a number of the authors in the anthology also belong to, called Word of Mouth, which is an organization that was established by another one of the writers in the anthology, Roxana Robinson, as a way to network and help writers, women writers, help each other the way that men have the old boys club. And so, Andrea, I want to begin by talking about STATOREC and how the idea of this coronavirus issue began and how it evolved into an anthology and also into the inspiration for these performance art pieces at here.
Well, it's a bit of a story, I suppose, but it started with an essay that I wrote and thought that I had to get out really quickly. I had come back from Florence at the end of February of this year, really just before the whole thing kind of became the disaster that it became. And I was able to continue working on a book that I had been working on there when I came back for about a month until, of course, we all ran out of steam because of this global phenomenon happening around us where everything seemed pretty meaningless pretty quickly. So I started working on an essay to try to absorb some of what was going on, and then realized around mid-April that I wanted to get it out rather quickly because everything was happening so quickly. And the different outlets that I was thinking of approaching would have taken too long. And so I decided to put it up on our own magazine. And then I talked to David Winner, who is also here this evening. We'll probably have a word from him later. But we co-edited this issue, but it really began with me publishing my essay, asking him to write one, and then we bounced it back and forth and started inviting other writers that we knew that we'd already published, and started approaching writers that we hadn't yet published, and before we knew it, we had an issue on our hands. But it was never intended as this huge thing that it became. In the end, we published 32 pieces in a 6-month period of time. So it was averaging something like two a week, with a lot of editing, a lot of back and forth, a very, very, very strong interaction with the writers that we were publishing.
Do you want to read a little bit from the introduction so it gives people an idea of what the anthology is about?
I'd love to, thank you. I'd say one word before I begin, to just, because I'm going to plunge right in. I'm going to plunge in more than halfway through the introduction of the anthology. I'm in Berlin. We're a Berlin and Brooklyn based magazine. We're a very small magazine. And so our purview really is, we don't see ourselves as a global magazine sort of trying to represent all of Europe and all of America or the whole world or something like that. It's really Berlin and basically Brooklyn at this point. And we had seen a number of disturbing parallels going on politically, let's say the way the virus was being politicized in the United States and beginning to be politicized here in a pretty similar way. So I'll just say that first, and I can plunge in. Okay, we had our own interesting scandal here in Berlin in the beginning of September, when a group of COVID deniers defying public health laws and holding a largely maskless demonstration, attempted to storm the German Reichstag building, which of course brought back all kinds of horror visions in people's minds. It was oddly underguarded. The police weren't expecting something like that to happen, given the highly symbolic meaning of the Reichstag. It was clear that we had a new movement going on here, the Corona deniers, basically. So this is where I'll begin from my introduction. Are American coronavirus deniers comparable to their German counterparts? In Europe, as in the United States and elsewhere, denying the existence of a global pandemic and defying basic measures to contain it can seem like a kamikaze mission, a form of collective insanity. Do they really believe that Bill Gates is conniving with other Illuminati to install a pharma-dictated technocracy to exert mind control through a legally mandated vaccine? Surely there's another explanation, another set of doubts and grievances fueling the movement. Germany has seen a resurgence of the highly charged phrase Lügenpresse, the lying press, an older German version of fake news that originated during World War I to counter enemy propaganda, and that infamously resurfaced during the Nazi era and again later as a reactionary anti-immigrant movement rose up in Germany in 2014. We live in volatile times on both sides of the Atlantic. Large parts of the population are becoming more polarized than ever before. And yet a dangerous divide has opened up between the measures mandated to contain contagion, the closure of schools, universities, daycare centers, and almost everything else that enables us to live the lives we've known until now, and the ruination of livelihoods and abrupt rise in bankruptcies, foreclosures, homelessness, mental illness, and domestic abuse. Some of the restrictions can seem unfair, while the official reasoning offered to justify them comes across as inconsistent at best. In Germany, theaters and cinemas are allowed to open at reduced capacity and under strict distancing measures, while airlines, evidently the more powerful lobby, continue to pack passengers into every available seat. The restrictions seem at least partly based on economic dictates. Culture is clearly less important than the aviation industry or the automobile industry. So are we being lied to? In the first days of lockdown, a solemn mood prevailed as we watched health workers battle an invisible enemy under inconceivable conditions. Overwhelmed by the sick and dying and forced to adopt triage measures otherwise implemented during wartime to distribute a limited number of ventilators to a far greater number of patients in dire need of them, we wept with doctors and nurses online, their faces bruised by countless hours of wearing PPE as they described the unbearable reality they were facing. As a new sense of solidarity took hold, we adhered to lockdown and quarantine. We scrubbed our hands and applauded essential workers every evening from our windows and balconies. And as anxiety gave way to an appreciation for the respite the virus was offering some of us, a temporary pause in the ever accelerating speed of modern life, a new feeling emerged. That the virus's appearance, in spite of all its perils and in spite of all the sacrifices required of us, harbored unprecedented potential. Some said that nature was telling us to slow down, that nature was giving humanity a chance to wake up and finally comprehend the urgent need for change. As the first lockdowns were eased, we watched citizens of countries with large tourism industries retake their streets, and in spite of the economic blow dealt to so many, the images of children playing in piazzas, normally packed with foreign crowds, seemed, at least to those of us enjoying the comparable luxury of home office, to carry a promise of some kind, a return to a more sane and humane way of living. This state of grace was short-lived, of course. The loss of livelihoods and the collapse of entire economic sectors would soon accelerate a backlash, during the course of which a degree of risk and potential contagion would become normalized. Human lives are not, as we're frequently told, merely lost to a dangerous virus, but to broken economies and financial ruin. But it's hard to ignore the feeling of a lost chance. After years of watching the world's governments fail to work together to bring about the necessary transition from carbon fuel to green energy alternatives, after scientific studies repeatedly revealed that reducing carbon emissions at such a late stage would at best alleviate only a small part of the inevitable devastating effects of global warming, but that this was far preferable to doing nothing and unleashing the worst case scenario on the world's most vulnerable communities. After watching politicians offer lip service at climate conferences as the status quo remained largely unchanged, suddenly everything seemed possible after all. industrialized countries were indeed rich enough to subsidize entire sections of the population as the skies turned to blue we hadn't seen since the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull, which 10 years ago had also brought international air travel to a standstill. It turns out that we can, in fact, reduce emissions. We can, in fact, slow down production. Why was the virus able to achieve this while the prospect of an uninhabitable planet was not? So this is a portion of my introduction. I have to say that, of course, we wrote our introduction and afterward before the election, and we were trying to think ahead to the time afterwards, and it was inconceivable. We had no idea what was coming up. If, as David Winner put it, if one septuagenarian would win or the other. It was trying to project oneself into the future, really. But
one of the things that I felt when I read through the anthology is it seems so long ago. We've been through a lifetime.
Yeah.
Since February and March, it's almost 9 months. And the way that we felt, what we didn't know at the beginning has been overridden about what we do know. And yet here we are at the beginning of the second wave, where all the lessons that we supposedly have learned for political reasons mostly are somehow being ignored or discarded. And we're faced again with the possibility of major lockdown. One of the themes that I think come across in the book is this our war? It's a time of deprivation. There are 2 essays, Roxana Robinson's essays, basically talking about the militarization of the police. And then Amy, the woman,
Amy Parkinson.
Amy Park, who lives in Oklahoma, talking about no masks and guns. And there is such a sense, as I read this, of chilling horror of all the elements that are coming together to basically make it seem like the pandemic is not alone the horror, but all the horrors that it's unleashed, And it's what you talk about is, this kind of the way that the right wing has sort of co-opted media, making, and it's exactly what happened in the rise of fascism, So is this our war? And you have a couple older gay men writing essays as well, who talk about their war, which was the AIDS virus. So a lot of the experience that they had is being replicated in the world right now. So I was wondering what you thought about that, and how do we confront this if this is our war?
Well, I don't know. I mean, famously, Macron also said, we are at war. I don't really see it as a war necessarily, but I'm not really, I don't want to quibble about metaphors at this point. I mean, what I think that what became really clear to us early on was that there was the virus, and then there was this viral political climate, and it seemed part of the same thing. It was part of a single continuum. And it's funny because when I had asked Roxana, I mean, what we also have to mention very, very strongly is that in the midst of all of this, really, in the summer, we suddenly had the Black Lives Matters protests, which were vilified in the press and which were extremely disciplined movement. I mean, that really quite exemplary for a hysterical time, showed incredible self-control and self-discipline. Some of our writers referenced this directly, and it was in this context also that I asked Roxana, knowing what she's written about, to write an essay about the militarization of the police, because this is what we were seeing. We were seeing a police force that was essentially a military force on the streets, treating peaceful protesters as though they were foreign combatants or something like that. And so she whipped up this essay in a record, period of time. But she then remarked to me afterwards, she felt that she wasn't sure how her essay really fit into the entire anthology. And then we corresponded about this. And this was when I began to call it a continuum, between the virus and the viral political climate. And that really clicked for her, and everything sort of came together, So yeah, people have spoken about this as a war. I think that, I guess what I tried to express in my introduction, what I've thought about since is just the sense of this lost opportunity, because I look also at countries like in Germany, Italy at the beginning. I mean, they had an unprecedented amount of deaths very, very quickly. It's just a traumatizing kind of experience. And yet they too are tired. People are tired of it. It's not just the loss of livelihoods. I think that the human brain functions in a certain way that if it's subjected to a traumatizing experience for too long a period of time, it becomes desensitized. And I think that we all feel this tiredness. So we're taking risks that we wouldn't have come near in the spring, hoping for a vaccine and so on and so forth. But it's, I don't know. I think that what lingers in my mind the most is a sense of a lost chance. There was this little feeling of hope that we would maybe wake up, whatever that means, really.
I am still a little bit optimistic, but maybe that's because I have a foot in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Where you had a compassionate leader who basically did the right thing, and the country listened to her. That's really what my essay is about. And when I think about war, I think about, because my parents were Holocaust survivors, which definitely always influences the way that I see things. By war, I mean sacrifice, deprivation. We're not hungry, we're not living, in holes in the ground, but people cannot see their relatives, people are dying alone, there's not enough PPE. So there's this sense in our lives where there's so much abundance that suddenly we have to, if we really take this virus seriously, consider others, stop thinking only about ourselves and what we can accumulate.
Yeah.
The emissions in America are the lowest it's been. There is an opportunity. We did kind of hopefully elect a new president who might pay more attention to the injuries on the planet and all of the issues that have been raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things I felt reading the book was, do you think that if there hadn't been a pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement would have coalesced with the force and unity that it did, even, with the trigger incident of George Floyd's murder?
I can't really say that, but I think sooner or later, of course, it would have, because it's an issue that just doesn't go away. It has to find some kind of resolution at some point. It really has to find some kind of definitive expression. And it's just, people are murdered on the streets, basically, and people rise up, and then everything settles again. I mean, at some point we have to reach the point where this is really, where we don't fall into this kind of repetitive amnesia about it.
One of the things that has increased the anxiety here is the nature of the leadership that we have here. And that not only are we afraid of the pandemic, but we would wake up every morning to some horrific tweet and have tremendous anxiety about the state of our nation, the state of our democracy. In light of that, Angela Merkel seems like a leader with a hold on her country, or at least is given some sort of, straightforward leadership. Is that how you feel? Is that what the country believes? Or is that sort of just an illusion that we have created because our own leadership has been so chaotic?
I think it's something in between, to tell you the truth. I mean, she enjoys enormous popularity here, but again, we have a fringe, and it's getting stronger. And I'm not sure that you're aware that there's this radical right-wing party, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, that has a number of seats in parliament. And we just had this scandal a couple of days ago where they let in some of these pretty anarchistic kind of behaving corona deniers who were almost accosting members of parliament. It's almost like a kind of a constitutional crisis at this point here. So it's there's a lot of anxiety. Merkel's term is going to be ending And there's a huge power struggle as to who's going to take over the party, and then of course who's going to run for chancellor. So I can't make any predictions, but I think that we're going to be seeing some volatile times here as well, for sure.
Going back to the anthology, one of the things I like about how it was organized is that you have some of the essays are sort of macro political, talking about the political, the economic effects of the virus. And then there's some very personal essays, like there's one about a woman navigating her mother getting a liver transplant.
Oh yeah.
Another one
Mhm.
about having an adult son with autism and having to sort of see him. So I think it's a really great overview about all, and then, there's what Beverly Golgorski, I think, am I pronouncing her name right, talking about being a new widow in her 80s, living alone in an apartment in Brooklyn, what that means, what isolation means. So, and I know that you've sort of put on a segue a couple of the here pieces, and I was wondering if you wanted to play one now. So
I'd love to. I'd love to. Yeah, I'll say a couple of words about that. We started a cooperation at some point. I don't remember when this began, if it was in July or August, with the Here Art Centers, a performance space in downtown Manhattan. We asked them if they wanted to work on something together with us, and we didn't really have anything clear in mind. And we wound up with a format that works up actually quite nice. It's a Vimeo playlist of many of our authors reading from their pieces, including you, Cheryl, including Barbara Fishkin, who is also here today. Joe Salvatore is here, and he's going to be sending me a video very, very soon. I think we have maybe 20 collected at this point. But let me, if I can find this here on my screen, give you a, just 1 second. See, this is the techie part that I practiced a couple of times.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
No, not
okay.
yet.
Okay, just a second. Okay, give me 1 second. I have to click share screen first. Exactly. Okay, here we go.
We hear
share.
read anything. Okay, you got it.
Sorry about that. Okay, you'll also get to see my whole desktop here, but I just I made a screenshot here of the playlist that we have up at the Here Art Center. And okay. And then I'll go into what I wanted to also show. Excuse me, takes a moment.
It's worth it, everybody.
Sorry. This is
there we go.
Okay. This is the cover of the book, and I'll talk about that really briefly because it leads actually into the first short video that I wanted to show. Mui Poopoksakul is a Thai writer living in Berlin. She's also a friend of mine. She's a very accomplished translator from Thai literature into English. Actually, she's a bilingual translator. I mean, I forgot the term for that when you're translating into something that's actually not your native tongue. But she's an award-winning translator from Thai language. She came home one day in the summer and found this blue vial of unidentifiable liquid in her mailbox, and didn't think much of it and took a closer look, and there's a little label wrapped around it saying SARS-19. And on the reverse side that you can't see here, there were 2 Chinese characters, and she looked into this and saw that this was a non-Chinese speaking person translating or trying to translate the word corona, but not the disease meaning of corona, but the meaning corona like a crown, into Chinese. And so she realized that this was, it dawned on her and her husband that this was a hate crime, and it was targeted towards her as an Asian. And it was meant to say, you Chinese are bringing us this deadly virus kind of thing. So I wanted to preface it with that, and let me find now okay, and here is share screen.
There she is.
That's Caille. Let me find.
No,
Okay,
I see,
here we go.
it's good.
Okay. Oops. Oh, sorry. Thank you for your patience, everybody. We'll do this again. Here's movie. Okay.
Downstairs,
Let me put this back to the beginning.
we weren't holding our breaths for anyone to come forward with information. Everyone I told the story to said the perpetrator surely lived in the building. I ran through the units in my mind. 5 residential floors with 2 apartments each, and 2 commercial spaces on the ground level. Who did we know? Who appeared friendly and who not? Everyone in the building seemed to enjoy the anonymity of city living, so there was only so much detective work we could do before we entered awkward or insane territory. Funny how in our time of social distancing, I'd never wanted to learn more about my neighbors than I did now. Eventually, I brought up the obvious, which was that our downstairs neighbor had complained via a typed note at the start of the lockdown that we stomped. Yes, she used all caps. It was giving her migraines. Naturally, we were annoyed. I found it hard to imagine you could have a neighbor more pussyfooted than me. I'm small and prone to cracked, even bleeding heels that have trained me to land softly. My husband quickly shut down the thought. Her complaint, though aggravating, was within the range of normal gripes among neighbors, and to accuse someone of racism based on that latter was unfair and irresponsible. I agreed and felt guilty for having harbored despicable thoughts. At the interview, the friendly teddy bear of a man detective informed me the blue liquid had been analyzed and it was innocuous, rubbing alcohol ironically. No fingerprints had been lifted because the vial was still held up at the Robert Koch Institute, which had yet to test the blue dye. My hope deflated. How many people were the police going to allow to handle the tube before they tried to extract fingerprints? I began to feel that in pursuing the case, I was making a point only to myself and to this detective before me, probably had homicide cases to solve. Anything else you'd like to add? He asked me. Well, I bit my tongue.
So that's part of Mui's story. We had discussed this over a number of weeks over the summer, and then I encouraged her to write a story about it, which she happily did for the issue.
What about, do you want to play another? It seems like a good segue to do.
I'd love to. Should I do Scott Martingale's first or Caille's?
Caille's, I think.
Okay. I'd like to tell everybody to turn your sound up because she recorded it with her voice is very, very soft.
And tell a little bit about Caille's story before.
Well, let me enter full screen here.
You've got it.
Okay. Talk about a bit of not really sure. I think that she introduces herself pretty well with her own piece. This is in direct reaction, of course, to the Black Lives Matters protests. Turn this back.
To distract myself from the terror, I started listening to John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. I don't know much about jazz. I picked the album because I wanted to hear something pleasant without a lot of lyrics. But what few lyrics they are. At the beginning of the album, Coltrane chants A Love Supreme over and over again. Like me, like Black America, he's stuck in repetition. Then he begins his famous improvisation, or at least what seems to be his famous improvisation. It's actually the same riff, played in all 12 possible keys. Coltrane is repeating the same thing over and over again. He's creating his mantra. With repetition comes the possibility of transformation. With repetition becomes the possible breakthrough of love. Once I recognized the pattern Coltrane had laid out, I was able to hear something different from the trees. These were not the protests of 1968 or 1992 or even 2015. Instead of dissipating, the protests grew larger. The usual propaganda was being employed about order and looters, but somehow it had lost some of its strength. Instead of being undermined, the protests attracted more age groups, more races, more solidarity, and more imagination. The repetition of despair had opened a crack for something new to seep through. You might even call it love.
That's lovely.
That's beautiful.
I think that's a good segue in talking about Joe Salvatore's essay in the nature of what language evolves out of our times. And he kept on talking about the words in the time of. What is the word he uses? A word for these phrases that become part of our culture and that get ingrained in our minds. You know, for me, growing up as a child of survivors, it's before the war. You know, it's sort of like before the war, there was this, and then like I knew nothing about before the war, and then there's after the war. And he's sort of saying in this very academic and profound way that we've sort of inculcated in the time of Corona, you know, and this is before the pandemic and after pandemic. And the nature of language and the nature of experience will forever be changed by that. And there's a little bit of that in Caille's, but Caille's is much more optimistic. But she just had a baby too, and I think she was, there's a lot of positivity and hope in her piece. And Joe Salvatore's piece about language is also filled with the dissonance of living in Queens, right by the Elmhurst Hospital, which was one of the great centers in New York City of the pandemic, where there was literally like morgue trucks outside dealing with all the bodies. And meanwhile, he's in this little apartment trying to teach with two little kids, and then having these, you know, these expositions about language. So there is really something about how we use language in describing our times and describing the nature of the pandemic, and how language is used to manipulate us or influence us or express our emotions. And I think that's very evident in the anthology as well.
Yeah, Joe's actually here. I wonder if he would care to say a couple of words about his own piece. I mean, it's a little bit spontaneous, but I'm not sure. He might be. Joe, are you there?
You know, speaking of my children, they're surrounding me, so I'm going to keep my camera off. I learned my lesson.
Okay.
I learned my lesson. Yeah, I mean, I can only say that the piece was first of all, I owe a lot of its realization to Andrea for sort of being the doula to it. It was coming out in different ways, but I couldn't fully bring it out somehow. And I realized that the problem was language, and I refer to it at some point in there. The writing, my own writing, suffered tremendously during the period. And I was working on a piece actually about language and writing, in a pedagogical scholarly article, and I couldn't bring it out because my children continued to bounce off the walls and bombard me with their presence. But far more than that, it was those moments in every email we sent that said, I hope you're okay. How are you doing? And one always was I always would say, I don't know where to begin with that answer. And I felt more and more that this thing that I had taken for granted, that I relied on so much to be a vehicle to get me through, you know, the most gravely personal moments in life, to the most global, systemic kinds of situations. Language always helped me to make sense of it. and it was failing me completely. And so, you know, the piece tried to come at language in a way that was utterly explicit about its efforts to do so, right? So that in that, you know, that the academic approach would be the most in one's head, and sort of alleviating the issues of fear and the body, you know, rebelling against the mind. And I tried somehow to capture that by juxtaposing that language with the much more personal moments in the piece about the journal and stuff like that. But it's a real, I look at this as one of the most important pieces I've ever written for that very reason. Nothing, and I say this in all honesty, could be as personal as the piece I wrote for this anthology.
I just want to add that I think a lot of the writers, like I'll talk about my experience. I had just come back from New Zealand at the beginning of the pandemic. And right when I came home, there was stuff going in my job that was very emotionally draining. And then my in-laws, who are in their 80s, were out of Wi-Fi contact on the South Island in a car, and they were closing the country down. And we had to get them on the last ferry so they could get home. And then everybody was safe. But there was so much anxiety in the beginning that when Andrea said, okay, I would like to get some essays, it gave me sort of focus to begin to write about my emotions. And I wound up writing 3 essays. The one that I submitted to Andrea about what it was like to live between 2 worlds during the virus, one that seemed very successful in handling its control of the virus, and another essay about my mother, who spent 5 years on a ventilator. And because there was so much talk about ventilators, and people being on ventilators, but people don't know the ravaging that it does to the human body. So, you know, this impulse that Andrea gave me, and it sounds like she gave Joe and a lot of other people, whoever's in the audience, was a way of sort of dealing with anxiety about the beginning of the pandemic and be able to organize our thoughts about it, because it seemed so much larger than anything else, and seemed to prevent, you know, the creative juices to go flowing. It gave us a direction, a way to express our emotion. So I'm grateful to you as well for that, you know, chance. Maris. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Am I back? Okay.
Yeah, you're
All right.
back.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I mean, altogether, we began this as a Corona issue of the magazine Statorec, and we thought we would maybe post 10, 12, 15 pieces, and it kept growing. At some point we thought, oh, this is going to be 20, and it wound up becoming 31 pieces in the end. So we averaged, I think, publishing 2 per week over 5 or 6 months. And it was only then that we realized we had a 300-page book on our hands if we actually wanted to go this route. But it was, what you described was also the case for quite a lot of the writers. I mean, we all found ourselves, I was able to work on my book for maybe a month after coming back from Italy. And by the beginning of April, it was impossible. I had to begin writing about the virus itself and what we were going through. It was this all-encompassing reality. And I think that the experience of everyone basically globally going through the same experience simultaneously was also one of these extraordinary things. But the experience that David and I'd like David actually also to say a couple of words, my co-editor, before the end of this. But we had this experience with many of the writers that when we asked them to contribute something, they jumped on it. Everybody basically jumped on it, because I think that everybody was in the same boat, not really knowing what the meaning was anymore of what they were doing, and your consciousness being completely occupied and monopolized by this thing that was really larger than all of us. And so it came as a great relief to many people to really just finally address this thing and to find some kind of mental space to address what it was also doing to our minds, to our thinking, the way we moved in space, the way personal relationships would become affected by this. Who was bringing home the contagion, you know, with people with teenage kids, you know, trying to communicate with them. You have to stop meeting your friends, kind of thing. You know, it's just our authors, I think, were really, most of them were really incredibly relieved to have an opportunity to write something in real time. I mean, this also, I want to also stress how quickly this all went. We don't normally work this way, that we write something and publish it a day later. You know, we let it sit and hope that we can sort of edit out the bad stuff, or let it also pass the test of time. I mean, we're not journalists, and we were publishing a lot of essays, and we were asking, before we made the decision to do an anthology, we were asking ourselves very seriously, will these pieces stand up to the test of time, or will they feel old in 2 months' time, 5 months' time, after the election? I mean, this was also the big question: what's going to happen after the election? We had no idea what was ahead, basically, and if this would all sort of seem like old news. And as the months passed by, we realized that we were performing a very important function of actually recording what we were going through before we would forget, because we knew that we would forget. We knew that there was other stuff up ahead that we were going to have to adapt to, and who knew what was going to be happening politically. But we wanted to at least record some spectrum of what people were going through individually. Yeah, so it was a bit of a roundabout answer, but
Good one.
well, we made the decision. I think we were still asking ourselves in August. We had done an interview with the Brooklyn Rail. I think that came out in the September issue. I'm not sure anymore. I think it was the September issue. And by the time that came out, we had just about decided, yes, we're going to do the anthology now. And then we had the incredible good luck of that Outpost 19 books. John Roemer of Outpost 19 had actually miraculously left a slot free in his fall 2020 schedule for, he said, exactly a project of this kind. And so we kind of just dovetailed into that, because I mean, I looked into a couple of other presses. I looked into the University of Massachusetts press, and you're dealing with 6 to 9 months waiting time. We realized if we're going to do this, it's going to have to come out fast, very, very fast. And so we were working on an enormously accelerated timeline. Everybody worked very, very, very hard. And so, yeah, David is
Herculean effort.
Yeah.
Herculean.
I'd love for David to say a couple of things also about the experience. Can we unmute Maris? Can we unmute David? Yeah, okay, you're good to go. Hi.
Thank you, everybody. I guess that the main thought I have is that when people write essays, obviously they're generally writing about unique experiences, things that have happened to them, that have not happened to other people. In fact, I was writing some kind of silly travel pieces about places I've been that not so many people have been to. But suddenly in this situation, everybody's writing is about something that everybody is experiencing. There's this kind of universality of all these different pieces, the essays, the poems, that it's, I mean, some of the pieces I think are kind of brilliantly literary, some are less so, but it's both the kind of literary anthology, but also an anthology that kind of checks the temperature of this moment. And good question about how it will age. I mean, I think it will age pretty well, because this moment will be kind of, soldered onto all our consciousness, and these pieces as a whole kind of express it pretty well, I think.
I agree. Andrea, do you have anything more to say? We can open it up to any questions.
I'd love to show one last video, which is one of my personal favorites, if I can play favorites. It's a friend of mine here in Berlin, Scott Martingale, who's actually a performance poet. And when we reached out to our authors, most people sat in front of the computer and read their pieces. And Scott, of course, true to character, decided to do something else. But I'd love to Okay, it's not very long. Just
You got the technology down, Andrea.
not completely. No. I'd have to practice this a bit more to get this down perfectly. But anyhow, here we go.
Well, that industry's gone, and this one's on its knees, and cruise ships for a generation, and this thing's written like dreams. Hitchhikers sticking their thumbs out for hours, and people in porn can't even rub shoulders. Street magicians are repurposing tricks, and Zoom masseurs are nudging out online shiatsu. The trick to get out of Moria is to be under 12 and alone, while I stay put or not. This is how I write when the news is on, glancing across at Goya. I'm an analog age that remembers the time before archive footage was slowed. B-listers are telling me the world is round and I should keep my distance from Trump going postal. If you can't say anything that's not on the news, you're just shouting in another room. I can hear you going through your travails, cutting your toenails. But what can I say? There's kids here shouting and adults working their passage through isolate grief. So hold your noise. I'm just scoping your bookshelves. Your minds and spines are mine to judge, you muppets.
Yeah. He's a slam poet, and he's also worked on soundtracks for movies, and I mean he's definitely a spoken word kind of writer, but he's
I have
anthology. Yeah, go ahead.
questions before we open up. One, where did the name STATOREC come from?
Well, it's short for statement of record.
And so, and the next edition of STATOREC will be on another topic?
Well, actually, we had never done an issue before. We have a blog kind of format, so we were publishing intermittently. So the Corona issue was our first actual discrete issue, and we do have another issue coming up, which is going to be on Turkish literature. And one of our contributing editors, John Casquarelli, who's teaching at the Koç University in Istanbul, he'll be guest editing this issue. We'll be supporting him in that. I think we'll be starting that actually pretty soon. And then I think after that, we'll be returning to our normal programming. But
Any questions from anybody?
Yeah, that would be.
Or any participants want to say, I know Barbara Fishkin is here.
We have a few of our authors here. Barbara's here. Amy Parkinson is here. It'd be nice for you both to say hi if you want. I don't want to.
Yeah.
Force you.
And before we say goodbye, there's a reminder. There's a link to buy the anthology. I've encouraged all our stores to put it on the tables. Because it's come out so fast. The distribution is still a little bit in the air, but I'm sure that if you want to read some of these essays, which are really extraordinary, I would encourage you to, turn on the link or come to us and see what we can do.
Yeah, I think the distribution will be sorted out in a couple of days. We had to. It's part of the accelerated timeline. I think that these book distribution connections aren't necessarily in place yet, but they should be any day now. But you can either order through Amazon, the dreaded enemy Amazon, or directly through the publisher. Sorry?
We're not allowed to say the A word.
I won't say the A word then. Okay. But you can order directly through Outpost 19. We put the link into the chat.
That would be much better for everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
I think, Maris, do you have anything else to say? Maris has come back to the screen.
No, just thank you to all. This was wonderful.
Thanks for hosting us. We really appreciate it.
And
thanks to everybody for coming.
Yeah, and thank you for staying up at 1 o'clock in the morning to join us at 7 p.m. And
Okay.
let's hope that, you know, we're going towards a better end of the spectrum. And it's a really wonderful, reflective anthology. You've done a tremendous amount of work, both of you, David and Andrea. I'm honored to be included in it. And thank you so much for coming this evening. And thank you, Maris, again.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's nice to see your faces. Okay.
Okay.